church bells of St. Bartholomew's were chiming 3 o'clock on that gloriously warm Saturday afternoon in late July, when Rosalind Fairweather disappeared from the annual village fête without so much as a whisper of explanation. Miss Cordelia Ashworth, seated comfortably in the shade of the ancient yew tree with her knitting bag and a cup of lukewarm tea, would later reflect that she should have paid more attention to the small inconsistencies that preceded the vanishing. But hindsight, as she often reminded her former students, was a luxury afforded only to those who survived to exercise it. The fête itself was proceeding with the gentle chaos that characterized such events in Bramblewick. White canvas stalls dotted the vicarage lawn like scattered handkerchiefs, their contents ranging from Mrs. Pemberton's prize-winning preserves to young Timothy Fletcher's rather ambitious woodworking projects. Bunting in cheerful primary colours stretched between the oak trees, fluttering in the warm breeze that carried the mingled scents of fresh scones, cut grass, and the late roses that climbed the vicarage walls with determined enthusiasm. Rosalind herself moved through the crowd with the graceful efficiency of someone born to such occasions. At 26, she possessed the kind of understated beauty that improved with acquaintance. Warm brown eyes that seemed genuinely interested in everyone she met, honey-coloured hair that refused to stay completely tidy despite her best efforts, and a smile that could coax donations from the most reluctant contributors. She had returned to Bramblewick 18 months earlier after her mother's death, abandoning a promising position with a London publishing house to care for her father and manage the increasingly complex demands of parish life. Miss Ashworth watched the young woman with the benevolent interest of someone who had taught 3 generations of village children and maintained a proprietary concern for their welfare. She noted how Rosalind paused to admire Mrs. Hartwell's somewhat lopsided Victoria sponge with genuine enthusiasm, how she diplomatically resolved a minor dispute between the competing jam makers, and how she managed to be everywhere at once without appearing hurried or flustered. The Reverend Dr. Edmund Fairweather, a scholarly man whose expertise in medieval Latin often left him unprepared for the practical demands of modern parish management, relied heavily on his daughter's organisational abilities. Miss Ashworth observed him moving through the crowd with the slightly bewildered air of someone who found social gatherings both necessary and exhausting. His relief whenever Rosalind appeared at his elbow to smooth over an awkward conversation or provide a forgotten name was palpable. The afternoon's entertainment followed the traditional pattern established over decades of village fêtes. Children shrieked with delight at the Punch and Judy show while their parents gossiped. Over cups of tea and slices of cake, the men gravitated toward the beer tent and the Skittles competition, while the women examined the handicraft displays with the critical eyes of experts. Miss Ashworth noticed the subtle social dynamics at play, who spoke to whom, who avoided certain conversations, who seemed unusually tense despite the festive atmosphere. Thomas Hartwell, the village's young solicitor, hovered near the bookstall with the determined persistence of someone who had not yet accepted defeat. His courtship of Rosalind had been a source of gentle speculation for months, though her polite but firm rejections had apparently done little to discourage his attentions. Miss Ashworth observed the way his jaw tightened whenever other men engaged Rosalind in conversation, particularly Dr. Marcus Webb, the handsome new physician who had recently established his practice in the neighbouring market town. Dr. Webb himself was something of an enigma. Charming and professionally competent, he had quickly established himself as a welcome addition to the local social scene. Yet Miss Ashworth's experienced eye detected something calculated in his easy manner, a quality that suggested his interest in village life might extend beyond mere professional courtesy. She watched him engage Rosalind in animated conversation near the flower competition, noting how the young woman's usual composure seemed slightly strained in his presence. The first sign of trouble came at 3:30 when Mrs. Pemberton approached the Reverend with barely concealed agitation. "Edmund, dear, have you seen Rosalind?" She was meant to help judge the children's art competition, but she seems to have disappeared. The Reverend glanced around with mild concern. "She was here just a moment ago, helping with the raffle tickets. Perhaps she's gone to fetch something from the house." But as the minutes stretched into a quarter hour, then 20 minutes, the casual inquiries became more urgent. Rosalind was not in the vicarage, nor in the church, nor anywhere in the immediate vicinity. Her handbag remained on the tea table where she had left it, her light summer cardigan draped over a chair despite the cooling afternoon air. Miss Ashworth set down her knitting and rose slowly, her keen eyes surveying the scene with renewed attention. She noticed several things that others, in their growing anxiety, had overlooked. The gate to the churchyard stood slightly ajar, though it was usually kept latched during public events. A programme from the fête lay crumpled near the vestry door, its pages torn as if someone had clutched it tightly. Most significantly, she observed that Dr. Webb's motor car, which had been parked prominently near the main gate, was no longer visible. The search began in earnest as the sun cast longer shadows across the village green. Volunteers fanned out through the churchyard, the surrounding lanes, and the meadows beyond the village boundaries. Voices, calling Rosalind's name, echoed through the summer evening, at first confident and cheerful, then increasingly desperate as the darkness gathered. Miss Ashworth remained near the vicarage, ostensibly out of the way, but positioned where she could observe the various search parties and their reactions. She noted who seemed genuinely distressed, who appeared merely concerned for appearances, and who exhibited signs of knowledge they were not sharing. Human nature, she had learned through decades of observation, was remarkably consistent in its inconsistencies. As the church clock struck 7 and the police were summoned from the county town, Miss Ashworth reflected on the afternoon's events with the methodical precision that had served her well in previous encounters with village mysteries. A young woman had vanished from a crowded public event without leaving any obvious trace of her departure, yet someone in Bramblewick knew exactly what had happened to the vicar's daughter and why they had chosen this particular day to make her disappear. The gentle rhythms of village life had been shattered by an act that was either desperately impulsive or carefully calculated. Miss Ashworth intended to discover which, and more importantly, why someone had found it necessary to remove Rosalind Fairweather from a world that seemed to value her presence so highly. The mystery of the vicar's daughter had begun, and with it, the careful unravelling of secrets that Bramblewick had kept hidden beneath its placid surface. The morning sun rose pale and hesitant over Bramblewick, as if uncertain whether to illuminate what the previous evening had concealed. By 7 o'clock the village had awakened to an atmosphere thick with unspoken questions and half-formed theories. The disappearance of Rosalind Fairweather had torn through the fabric of their orderly existence like a stone through still water, sending ripples of speculation in every direction. Miss Ashworth, who had risen early despite the previous night's disturbances, made her customary walk to collect fresh milk from Farmer Henley's dairy. She moved with deliberate purpose, understanding that the morning's conversations would reveal more about Bramblewick's hidden currents than any formal investigation might uncover. In her experience, villages were like ancient manuscripts. Their true meaning lay not in the bold text, but in the marginalia, the whispered corrections, and the carefully erased passages. The first theories began circulating with the milk delivery. Mrs. Higgins, the postmistress, had transformed her morning rounds into an intelligence-gathering operation, her bicycle laden with more than letters. By the time Miss Ashworth reached the high street, every shop and cottage buzzed with urgent conversation. At the post office, Mrs. Ivy Coulter held court behind her scales, weighing both parcels and opinions with equal precision. "Mark my words," she declared to Mrs. Pemberton, who had arrived early ostensibly to post a letter, but clearly to gather information, "that Dr. Webb left the fete in quite a hurry. Motor car gone like a shot just after 3 o'clock. What sort of gentleman abandons a village celebration unless he's got pressing business elsewhere?" Mrs. Pemberton's eyes gleamed with the satisfaction of someone whose suspicions were being validated. "I saw them together by the flower display, Rosalind and the doctor. She looked quite flustered, and he was leaning in rather close. Too close for propriety, if you ask me. These modern doctors with their smooth manners and London ways, they turn a girl's head with promises they never intend to keep." Miss Ashworth, selecting stamps with apparent concentration, noted the eagerness with which both women embraced this romantic explanation. It satisfied their need for drama while confirming their prejudices about outsiders and modern morality. Yet something in their tone suggested they were trying to convince themselves as much as each other. At Henderson's general store, a different theory was taking root. Mr. Geoffrey Hartwell, Thomas's father and the village's senior solicitor, was discussing matters in hushed tones with Dr. Jameson, the elderly physician who had served Bramblewick for decades before Dr. Webb's arrival. The family's financial situation has been precarious since Mrs. Fairweather's illness, Mr. Hartwell was saying, his voice carrying the measured authority of someone accustomed to handling delicate matters. The medical expenses were considerable, and the vicarage requires extensive repairs. Young Rosalind has been managing all the parish accounts, the roof fund, the various charitable collections. Perhaps the burden became too much to bear. Dr. Jameson nodded gravely. I've observed signs of strain in recent months. The poor child has been trying to maintain her mother's extensive charitable commitments while managing her father's affairs and organising parish events. When I suggested she might benefit from assistance, she refused quite adamantly. This perspective painted Rosalind's disappearance in more practical terms, not romantic folly, but financial desperation. Miss Ashworth found this theory more compelling than the romantic speculation, though she noted how Mr. Hartwell's eyes avoided direct contact when he mentioned the parish accounts. The morning service at St. Bartholomew's provided another venue for observation. Miss Ashworth noted who attended and who remained conspicuously absent. Thomas Hartwell sat rigid in his family pew, his face drawn with what appeared to be genuine anguish, though his mother seemed more interested in observing others' reactions than in the Reverend's stammered prayers. Dr. Webb had not appeared, though his absence might be explained by professional obligations. More intriguing was the presence of several villagers who rarely attended services, their motivation clearly curiosity rather than devotion. Miss Ashworth observed their behaviour carefully, noting who seemed genuinely concerned and who appeared to be gathering material for future gossip. After the service, the churchyard became an impromptu forum for continued speculation. Mrs. Hartwell approached Miss Ashworth with the determined air of someone seeking validation. "Miss Ashworth, surely you must have some insight into this dreadful business. Thomas has been beside himself. He's convinced someone has done Rosalind harm." Miss Ashworth adjusted her prayer book thoughtfully. "Human nature, my dear Mrs. Hartwell, is remarkably consistent in its capacity for surprising us. People often act in ways that contradict our expectations, particularly when circumstances press upon them." This observation seemed to perplex Mrs. Hartwell, who clearly preferred her explanations more definitive. Miss Ashworth noted Thomas's assumption of foul play with interest. It suggested either genuine concern or a desire to deflect attention from other possibilities. By midday, when Inspector Brant arrived from the county town with 2 constables, Bramblewick had generated enough theories to fill a sensation novel. The inspector, a methodical man with patient eyes and a greying moustache, established his headquarters in the vicarage study and began the systematic process of formal interviews. Miss Ashworth positioned herself where she could observe these proceedings without interfering. She watched who seemed cooperative and who appeared evasive, noting inconsistencies in various accounts. The inspector focused on obvious witnesses, those who had seen Rosalind last, the ladies who had worked alongside her at the fete, even old Mr. Grumbles, the vicarage gardener. Yet Miss Ashworth noticed that certain details were being overlooked in the rush to establish timeline and motive. The torn programme near the vestry door, the unlatched churchyard gate, the misplaced raffle ticket, these anomalies that had caught her attention remained dismissed as mere debris from a busy event. As afternoon shadows lengthened, a more sophisticated theory emerged from the village's professional class. Mr. Crake, the grocer, suggested quietly that Rosalind might have discovered financial irregularities in the parish accounts and been silenced to protect someone's reputation. This theory gained traction among those who understood that village respectability often concealed deeper corruptions. Miss Patterson, the schoolmistress, proposed that Rosalind had suffered some form of nervous collapse and wandered off in a confused state. "The poor girl has been under tremendous pressure," she confided to Miss Ashworth over tea. "Managing her father's affairs, organising parish events, maintaining her mother's charitable work, it would overwhelm anyone." Yet the most intriguing conversation Miss Ashworth overheard took place near the war memorial, where 2 younger village women spoke in hushed tones about Dr. Webb's recent behaviour. "His interest in Rosalind has been rather intense," one murmured. "I saw them talking after last Sunday's service. It looked quite heated, though they tried to appear casual." By evening, as the village settled into an uneasy routine of speculation and anxiety, Miss Ashworth reflected on the patterns emerging from the day's conversations. Each theory reflected the personal concerns and prejudices of its proponent. Those worried about moral standards blamed romantic impropriety. Those familiar with financial pressures suggested economic desperation. Those who distrusted outsiders focused on Doctor Webb's suspicious departure. Yet none of these explanations adequately addressed the specific circumstances of Rosalind's vanishing. A young woman did not simply evaporate from a crowded public event without leaving some trace of her departure method or destination. Someone in Bramblewick possessed knowledge they were not sharing, and Miss Ashworth intended to discover both the identity of that person and their reasons for maintaining silence. The inspector's investigation would continue along conventional lines, pursuing obvious suspects and clear motives. But Miss Ashworth understood that the truth about Rosalind Fairweather's disappearance lay hidden beneath the surface of village respectability, waiting to be uncovered by someone who understood that human nature's deepest secrets were often concealed behind its most ordinary facades. The vicar's daughter had vanished, but she had not dissolved into summer air. Someone knew where she had gone and why, and Miss Ashworth was determined to discover the truth before Bramblewick's carefully maintained peace claimed another victim. The morning sun cast long shadows across the vicarage lawn as Inspector Brant established his methodical approach to unravelling Saturday's events. By 9 o'clock, he had transformed the Reverend's study into a makeshift headquarters, its leather-bound theological volumes now serving as silent witnesses to a decidedly earthly mystery. Miss Ashworth, having volunteered to assist Mrs. Davies with the endless stream of tea and sympathy that such occasions demanded, positioned herself where she could observe both the formal proceedings and the informal reactions of those awaiting their turn. The inspector's technique was thorough and professional, focusing on establishing a precise timeline of Rosalind's final hours at the fete. Yet Miss Ashworth found herself more intrigued by what the witnesses chose not to say, the subtle hesitations and carefully constructed explanations that revealed as much as any direct testimony. Mrs. Pemberton was among the first to be interviewed, her account delivered with the righteous certainty of someone who prided herself on observational skills. "I saw Rosalind by the cake tent at precisely 3 o'clock, Inspector. She was speaking with young Thomas Hartwell about the raffle prizes. Then she mentioned checking on the bell-ringing demonstration before returning to help judge the children's art competition." Miss Ashworth noted this testimony carefully, remembering Mrs. Pemberton's earlier declaration to Mrs. Coulter that Rosalind's absence had been noticed when the bell chimed past. The fete programme, still pinned to the notice board, clearly indicated that the children's Punch and Judy show ran from 2:30 to 3 o'clock, not the earlier time Mrs. Pemberton now claimed. People often adjusted their memories to support their preferred version of events, Miss Ashworth reflected, particularly when those versions cast them in a more observant light. Thomas Hartwell's interview proved equally revealing, though not in ways he likely intended. His testimony was precise, almost rehearsed, accounting for his movements with the methodical detail of legal training. Yet Miss Ashworth observed how his hands trembled slightly as he described his final conversation with Rosalind, and how his eyes avoided direct contact when discussing his whereabouts during the crucial 20-minute period when she vanished. "I was examining the bookstall," Thomas stated firmly. Mrs. Coulter had some interesting volumes on local history that I thought might interest Father's research. But Mrs. Coulter had mentioned to Miss Ashworth that the bookstall had been temporarily unattended during that exact period while she helped serve tea. Either Thomas's memory was faulty, or he had reasons for concealing his actual location during those vital minutes. Dr. Webb's testimony, when he finally arrived from his morning rounds, was delivered with professional composure that somehow felt too carefully maintained. His account of Saturday afternoon was remarkably detailed for someone claiming only casual acquaintance with the missing woman. He recalled specific conversations, precise timing, even the contents of Rosalind's plate at the tea table. "I spoke briefly with Miss Fairweather near the flower display," he explained smoothly. "She seemed somewhat preoccupied, mentioned having several tasks to complete before the afternoon's end. I was called away shortly after by an urgent medical case in Little Charwell, a child with severe respiratory distress." Miss Ashworth found this explanation curious, particularly given that Dr. Webb's calling card remained precisely placed on the vicarage hall table. A physician departing in medical emergency would hardly pause to arrange his social obligations so carefully. The Reverend Dr. Fairweather's interview proved most distressing to observe. His genuine bewilderment and fragmented recollections painted the picture of a man utterly dependent on his daughter's organisational abilities. Yet Miss Ashworth detected something troubling beneath his grief, a nervous energy that suggested concerns extending beyond mere paternal worry. "Rosalind managed all our financial affairs," he explained to Inspector Brant. "The parish accounts, charitable collections, building fund contributions. I have no head for such matters. She handled everything with remarkable efficiency." His hands moved restlessly as he spoke, repeatedly straightening papers on his desk and adjusting the position of a leather-bound ledger marked Parish Accounts. Miss Ashworth noted how he closed the book without looking, as if its contents were somehow troubling. Young Sarah Fletcher provided perhaps the most intriguing testimony, her sharp eyes and honest manner impressing both the inspector and Miss Ashworth. She recalled seeing a figure in a light summer dress walking quickly toward the old mill path sometime after 3 o'clock, though the distance had prevented definitive identification. "It might have been Miss Fairweather," Sarah told Inspector Brant. "The dress was the right colour, and the person moved with purpose, like someone with an urgent destination. But I was helping Father with the bread stall and didn't think to pay closer attention until later." This sighting suggested Rosalind might have left the fete grounds voluntarily, yet her abandoned handbag and cardigan contradicted any planned departure. As the interviews progressed, Miss Ashworth began cataloguing the physical anomalies that formal investigations seemed to overlook. Old Mr. Grumbles, the gardener, insisted with wounded pride that the churchyard gate had been properly latched at noon but found open later. The bell ropes, normally coiled with meticulous precision by Mr. Liddon, hung in careless loops that suggested unfamiliar hands. Most intriguingly, the torn fete programme near the vestry door bore traces of lemon curd, Mrs. Pemberton's specialty, though she claimed not to have entered the church that afternoon. The accumulating inconsistencies painted a picture far more complex than romantic entanglement or financial desperation could explain. Miss Ashworth observed how each witness seemed determined to place themselves in locations that provided alibis, while simultaneously offering theories that deflected attention from their own potential involvement. Mrs. Hartwell's aggressive defence of her son's character, Thomas's carefully constructed timeline with convenient gaps, Doctor. Webb's too detailed recollections coupled with hasty departure. Each suggested knowledge being deliberately concealed rather than accidentally forgotten. As afternoon shadows lengthened and the formal interviews concluded, Miss Ashworth reflected on the patterns emerging from the testimonies. The investigation was proceeding along conventional lines, yet the evidence suggested something far more calculated than spontaneous disappearance. Someone in Bramblewick possessed crucial information about Rosalind's fate, and their careful misdirection indicated both guilt and desperation. The vicar's daughter had not simply vanished into summer air. Her disappearance was the result of human agency, human calculation, human fear, and human nature. In Miss Ashworth's considerable experience, always revealed its secrets to those who understood that truth often lay hidden in the spaces between what people said and what they carefully avoided saying. The formal investigation had gathered facts, but Miss Ashworth was beginning to perceive the deeper currents of motive and opportunity that would ultimately reveal both Rosalind's fate and her destroyer's identity. By Tuesday morning, Inspector Brant's methodical investigation had begun to crystallize around Thomas Hartwell with the inexorable logic of water finding its natural course. The transformation from grieving community member to primary suspect occurred with startling swiftness, driven by revelations that seemed to emerge from Bramblewick's collective memory like photographs developing in solution. The catalyst came through Mrs. Finch, the vicarage housekeeper, whose second interview revealed information she had initially withheld out of misguided discretion. Her testimony, delivered with the uncomfortable satisfaction of someone forced to share unpleasant truths, painted Thomas's recent behaviour in an entirely different light. It was Thursday afternoon, just 2 days before the fete, Mrs. Finch explained to Inspector Brant, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Young Mr. Hartwell came to see the Reverend about a private matter. I couldn't help but overhear. Their voices became quite raised. The Reverend was telling him that Rosalind had made her feelings clear and that his continued pursuit was becoming inappropriate. Miss Ashworth, who had arrived ostensibly to return a borrowed prayer book, positioned herself where she could observe both the testimony and the inspector's reactions. Mrs. Finch's account carried the polish of repeated internal rehearsal, each detail precisely placed for maximum impact. Thomas became quite agitated, Mrs. Finch continued, warming to her narrative. He accused the Reverend of encouraging Dr. Webb's attentions while discouraging his own, said something about the family's financial difficulties, and Dr. Webb's true motives. The Reverend ordered him to leave immediately, and Thomas stormed out shouting about disgraceful behaviour and ruining a good name. Quite shocking, really. This confrontation provided Inspector Brant with the clear motive he required, a rejected suitor harbouring public humiliation and private resentment. Thomas's earlier testimony about his whereabouts during the crucial period now seemed less like confused recollection and more like deliberate obfuscation. When Thomas was summoned for his second formal interview, the change in his demeanour was immediately apparent. Where he had previously seemed grief-stricken and cooperative, he now appeared defensive and increasingly agitated. His carefully constructed timeline began showing significant gaps under closer scrutiny. "I may have walked toward the mill path," Thomas admitted, when confronted with Sarah Fletcher's sighting of a figure moving in that direction. "I needed some quiet moments to collect my thoughts. The atmosphere at the fete had become rather overwhelming after my conversation with the Reverend." Inspector Brant leaned forward slightly. "The mill path leads directly to Bramblewood, Mr. Hartwell, an isolated area where someone might easily be concealed. How long were you away from the fete grounds?" "Perhaps 15 minutes, Thomas replied, though his voice lacked conviction. "I wasn't paying particular attention to the time." Miss Ashworth noted the small details that seemed to escape official attention, the slight tremor in Thomas's hands when he mentioned his conversation with the Reverend, the way his eyes avoided direct contact when discussing his solitary walk, the ink stain on his left thumb that suggested recent document handling. Yet something in his distress seemed more consistent with genuine bewilderment than guilty conscience. The discovery of additional evidence on Wednesday morning appeared to seal Thomas's fate. Constable Morrison, conducting a systematic search of the mill path area, found a delicate handkerchief bearing the initial R, caught on brambles approximately half a mile from the village. The lace trim matched descriptions of handkerchiefs Rosalind was known to carry, and its location supported the theory that she had indeed travelled in that direction. Yet Miss Ashworth found this discovery suspiciously convenient. The handkerchief was positioned where any competent search would eventually locate it, almost as if placed deliberately. Moreover, the fabric showed remarkably little weathering for something exposed to 3 days of summer rain and morning dew, an anomaly that seemed to escape official notice. During Thomas's third interview, Inspector Brant pressed harder on the timeline discrepancies. Thomas's alibi for Saturday evening proved equally problematic. He claimed to have spent the evening at home preparing legal documents, but his housekeeper's day off meant no corroboration, and neighbours reported seeing no lights in his study windows during the claimed working hours. Miss Ashworth observed these proceedings with growing unease. While Thomas's behaviour warranted investigation, the rush to establish his guilt overlooked several troubling inconsistencies. She noted how his walking stick, propped in the vicarage umbrella stand, bore traces of pale clay on its ferrule, the distinctive marl from the millstream area that differed markedly from the darker churchyard soil. When Thomas explained this evidence by claiming he had walked the river path the previous evening, "because I could not sit idle," Miss Ashworth recognised both the plausibility and the convenient timing of such an explanation. Truth and deception often wore remarkably similar faces. The formal arrest occurred Thursday morning with ceremonial gravity. Thomas maintained his innocence with desperate intensity while his father attempted to secure London legal representation. The village received the news with mixed satisfaction, relief at having identified the culprit, tinged with unease at the proximity of violence to their ordered existence. Miss Ashworth watched from her garden gate as Thomas was led away, noting the satisfaction with which certain villagers observed his downfall. Mrs. Hartwell's social pretensions had generated considerable resentment over the years, and her son's disgrace provided opportunities for settling old scores under the guise of moral indignation. Yet several aspects continued troubling Miss Ashworth's analytical mind. Thomas's emotional state seemed more consistent with genuine bewilderment than guilty knowledge. His repeated questions about Rosalind's actual whereabouts suggested concern for her welfare rather than awareness of her fate. Most significantly, his legal training would have warned against leaving such obvious evidence as the conveniently placed handkerchief. The investigation's focus on Thomas also meant other potentially significant leads remained unexplored. Doctor. Webb's hasty departure, the Reverend's nervous behaviour regarding parish finances, the minor inconsistencies in witness statements, all were being overlooked in favour of the more dramatic narrative of rejected love turned violent. As Thursday evening settled over Bramblewick with Thomas confined in the county jail, Miss Ashworth reflected on the dangerous satisfaction with which the village had embraced this solution. The community's need for resolution had overcome their commitment to justice, creating conditions where guilt was assumed rather than proven. But Rosalind Fairweather remained missing, and Miss Ashworth suspected her fate was connected to secrets far more complex than romantic disappointment could explain. The real perpetrator walked free in Bramblewick, protected by the community's eagerness to believe in Thomas's guilt and their reluctance to examine more uncomfortable possibilities. While Bramblewick settled into the comfortable certainty of Thomas Hartwell's guilt, Miss Ashworth found herself increasingly troubled by the very tidiness of the solution. Friday morning brought that peculiar quiet that follows public scandal. Not peace, but suspension, as if the village held its breath waiting for the next revelation. She distrusted such artificial calm, having observed that truth rarely announced itself with such convenient timing. Her weekly visit to the lending library provided the first thread that would unravel the carefully constructed narrative. Mrs. Thornbury, the librarian, was still discussing Thomas's arrest with evident satisfaction when Miss Ashworth approached the returns desk, ostensibly seeking a novel for a friend. "Such a relief to have the matter settled," Mrs. Thornbury declared, stamping a returned volume with unnecessary force. "Though I must say, poor Rosalind's final library transaction was rather peculiar. She returned the Hampshire Charities Register on Thursday afternoon, 2 days before it was due. Most unlike her, she was always precisely punctual with her borrowing." Miss Ashworth felt that familiar tingle of recognition that accompanied truly significant discoveries. Thursday afternoon? How unusual indeed. Quite flustered about it too, Mrs. Thornbury continued, consulting her records. Said she wouldn't be needing it after all, though she'd specifically requested we order it from the county library. Something about comparing charitable disbursements across parishes for best practices. Such a conscientious girl. This detail struck Miss Ashworth as profoundly important. Rosalind's methodical nature made early returns highly irregular, suggesting either completed research or abandoned plans. Given the specialized nature of the publication, neither explanation seemed entirely satisfactory. After completing her library business, Miss Ashworth walked slowly towards St. Bartholomew's, her mind working to place this information within the larger pattern of events. The church grounds remained largely undisturbed since the fete, though groundskeepers had cleared most obvious debris. Her attention was drawn to the vestry area, where recent rain had preserved several footprint impressions with remarkable clarity. Most prints showed expected patterns: the Reverend's distinctive Oxford shoes, Mrs. Finch's practical boots, various parishioners' Sunday footwear. But one impression stood out with startling significance: a narrow shoe print with an unusual diamond pattern sole, pressed deep into the soft earth beside the vestry door. More intriguingly, traces of pale, sticky clay clung to the flagstones inside the vestry itself, not the dark churchyard loam or light fet ground dust, but the distinctive marl from the mill stream path. Miss Ashworth recognised this particular sole pattern from her observations during recent village events. It belonged to expensive London footwear, worn by someone unaccustomed to unpaved surfaces. The print's location, directly beside the rarely used vestry entrance rather than the main pathway, suggested deliberate stealth rather than casual purpose. Inside the vestry, her experienced eye detected subtle anomalies that formal investigation had overlooked. A chair positioned differently than usual, papers on the secretary's desk arranged in unfamiliar order, slight displacement of the parish record books. Most significantly, the clay traces were concentrated near the filing cabinet containing financial records, as if someone had stood there for an extended period while examining documents. Her investigation was interrupted by Dr. Webb's unexpected arrival. His surprise at finding the vestry occupied was swift but unmistakable, though his recovery was professionally smooth. "Miss Ashworth, How unexpected. I was hoping to leave some medical supplies for the Reverend. He's been rather unwell since this dreadful business. His explanation seemed reasonable, yet Miss Ashworth observed that he carried no medical bag. Moreover, his shoes, expensive leather, with distinctive diamond-patterned soles, matched the print she had discovered outside. "How thoughtful of you, Doctor. I trust his condition isn't serious?" "Nothing that rest won't cure, Doctor." Webb replied, perhaps too quickly. "The shock has affected him considerably. I've recommended minimal excitement until this matter resolves itself." Miss Ashworth noted his assumption that the matter would indeed resolve itself, an interesting perspective given Rosalind's continued absence. She also observed how his eyes briefly scanned the vestry interior, as if checking whether anything had been disturbed. Their conversation was brief and superficially cordial, yet she detected underlying tensions that suggested doctor. Webb's presence served purposes beyond medical consultation. His departure was swift and decisive, leaving her alone to contemplate the implications. Walking home through the lengthening shadows, Miss Ashworth assembled these fragments into a more complex picture. The library book returned early suggested Rosalind had discovered something that changed her research priorities. The vestry evidence indicated someone else shared that interest in parish records, possibly seeking to conceal or alter information Rosalind might have uncovered. The expensive shoes and careful approach suggested not Thomas Hartwell's desperate improvisation, but someone else's calculated action. Someone who possessed both the sophistication to access locked areas and the knowledge to locate specific documents within the parish filing system. As evening settled over Bramblewick, Miss Ashworth reflected on the dangerous game being played beneath the village's placid surface. While the community celebrated Thomas's arrest as resolution, the real perpetrator remained free, protected by assumptions and misdirection that had successfully concealed their involvement. The Hampshire Charities Register, returned in apparent haste, suggested financial irregularities that someone desperately wanted to remain hidden. The vestry visit indicated active efforts to suppress evidence, while Dr. Webb's behaviour suggested knowledge he was reluctant to share. Miss Ashworth understood that truth often announced itself through precisely such overlooked evidence, small inconsistencies that others found too insignificant to examine closely. The devil, as she had often observed, resided in details that revealed the complex motivations driving ordinary people to extraordinary deceptions. The mystery of the vicar's daughter was far from solved, and Miss Ashworth was determined to uncover the truth before Bramblewick's carefully maintained facade claimed another victim. The weekend brought an unseasonable chill to Bramblewick, as if the village's buried secrets were finally rising to disturb its carefully maintained surface. Miss Ashworth understood that truth, like persistent weeds, had a way of pushing through even the most carefully tended facades. Her systematic approach to uncovering these hidden grievances began with those closest to the heart of the mystery. Mrs. Finch arrived at Miss Ashworth's cottage on Saturday morning, her usual composure replaced by obvious distress. The housekeeper's hands trembled as she accepted tea, her eyes darting nervously as if expecting unwelcome observers. "Miss Ashworth, I must speak with someone about those dreadful accusations against young Thomas," Mrs. Finch began, her voice barely above a whisper. "I fear I may have misled the inspector about the true nature of his confrontation with the Reverend." Miss Ashworth set down her teacup with deliberate calm, recognizing the significance of this confession. The story that emerged painted Thursday's heated exchange in an entirely different light. Thomas had not come as a rejected suitor demanding satisfaction, but as a concerned solicitor, warning of potential financial irregularities. Thomas had been reviewing the parish accounts at his father's request, Mrs. Finch explained, her voice gaining strength as she unburdened herself. The elder Mr. Hartwell serves on the Diocesan Finance Committee and had noticed certain discrepancies in our quarterly reports. Thomas was trying to help the Reverend understand the implications before any formal investigation began. The revelation cast the entire investigation in a new perspective. Rather than romantic rivalry, the confrontation had concerned missing funds from various charitable collections, particularly the substantial donations raised for the church roof and Children's Hospital Fund. The Reverend became quite defensive, Mrs. Finch continued, claimed that Rosalind managed all financial matters, and that any irregularities must be clerical errors. But Thomas pressed him about specific transactions, and the Reverend's responses became increasingly agitated. Finally, he ordered Thomas to leave, and threatened to report him to the Law Society if he continued his inquiries. Miss Ashworth absorbed this information with growing understanding. The Reverend's financial difficulties had apparently begun during his wife's extended illness, when enormous medical expenses exceeded the modest vicarage income. Faced with his wife's suffering and his own helplessness, he had begun supplementing their resources with funds intended for charitable purposes. Her afternoon investigation took her to the church where Mr. Liddon, the bell captain, provided another crucial piece of the puzzle. His spare vestry key had mysteriously disappeared for several hours on Saturday, then reappeared in the collection drawer. "Only the Reverend knew I kept a spare," Mr. Liddon explained, "and Doctor Webb, as I lent it him Tuesday last, said he needed to examine the gallery for a health talk, though no such talk ever happened." This detail aligned perfectly with the diamond-patterned footprints Miss Ashworth had discovered in the vestry. Dr. Webb's involvement extended beyond mere medical consultation to include direct access to parish records during the crucial period of Rosalind's disappearance, when Miss Ashworth encountered Dr. Webb at his surgery. His usual professional composure showed distinct strain. His careful responses to her gentle inquiries revealed knowledge he was reluctant to share directly. "The Reverend's financial difficulties have been more severe than generally known, Doctor," Webb admitted when pressed. "During my treatment of his late wife, I became aware of certain irregularities in his methods of funding her care. Private treatments, experimental medications, consultations with London specialists, all far beyond his official means." The admission confirmed Miss Ashworth's growing suspicions. Dr. Webb's involvement included knowledge of, and possibly complicity in, the financial deceptions that had funded Mrs. Fairweather's treatment. "I fear Rosalind discovered the extent of her father's borrowing from parish funds, Doctor," Webb continued. "She approached me Thursday evening, quite distressed, seeking advice about how to address the situation without destroying her father's reputation." This timing aligned perfectly with Rosalind's early return of the Hampshire Charities Register. She had completed her research, confirmed her worst fears about systematic embezzlement, and sought guidance from someone she trusted regarding the devastating implications. The physical evidence supported this narrative. The torn fate programme near the vestry door, stained with Mrs. Pemberton's distinctive lemon curd, indicated Rosalind had indeed entered the church building during the crucial period. Mrs. Pemberton herself confirmed seeing Rosalind slip into the vestry with someone tall, discussing money in heated tones. "Not a grant, it's theft," in Rosalind's clear voice. The bell-ringing demonstration had provided perfect cover for a clandestine meeting, its cacophony drowning out conversation while the gathered crowd's attention was diverted elsewhere. Dr. Webb's borrowed key had enabled access to the parish records, while his medical reputation provided unquestioned explanations for private consultations with both father and daughter. As evening settled over Bramblewick, Miss Ashworth reflected on the dangerous web of complicity that had ensnared the Fairweather family. The Reverend's desperate love for his dying wife had corrupted his moral judgment, leading to systematic theft from charitable funds. Dr. Webb's involvement suggested either blackmail or partnership in concealing these crimes, while Rosalind's meticulous investigation had threatened to expose the entire conspiracy. The village's eager acceptance of Thomas Hartwell's guilt had provided perfect cover for the real perpetrators, whose sophisticated deception required both medical knowledge and intimate familiarity with parish procedures. Financial desperation had corrupted a man of God, professional authority had been perverted to enable theft, and an innocent young woman had paid the ultimate price for threatening to expose the truth. The mystery was approaching its climax, but Miss Ashworth understood that revealing the truth would require careful preparation. The real perpetrators possessed both the desperation to eliminate threats and the sophistication to conceal their crimes beneath Bramblewick's respectable surface. Sunday morning arrived with an oppressive stillness that seemed to press against Bramblewick's windows like a held breath. Miss Ashworth had spent a restless night contemplating the web of financial deception she had uncovered, when the urgent clanging of the church bell, not the measured call to worship, but the frantic alarm reserved for emergencies, shattered the dawn quiet. Mrs. Finch's cries from the vicarage carried across the green with desperate clarity. The Reverend Dr. Fairweather had vanished from his study sometime during the night, leaving behind only a typewritten letter addressed to Inspector Brant and the lingering scent of Dr. Webb's medical supplies. Miss Ashworth arrived among the first responders, her trained eye immediately cataloguing the scene's carefully arranged elements. The letter, spread prominently on the Reverend's desk, confessed to unbearable shame over mismanaged parish funds, and concluded with the ominous declaration that he would seek God's judgment by the waters where earthly voices cannot follow. Yet everything about the confession struck Miss Ashworth as profoundly wrong. The Reverend's correspondence invariably employed his fountain pen on cream notepaper, never the vicarage typewriter he reserved for parish bulletins. His scholarly precision with Latin punctuation was legendary, yet the phrase mea culpa, mea maxima culpa lacked the comma he invariably inserted. Most tellingly, the typewriter ribbon showed recent replacement, its fresh black impression contrasting sharply with the faded characters on other documents. Inspector Brant, summoned urgently from his lodgings, read the confession with grim satisfaction. Here was resolution, the guilty party eliminating himself before justice could intervene. Yet Miss Ashworth observed how Dr. Webb, arriving with suspicious promptness, guided the inspector's interpretation toward convenient conclusions. The poor man's conscience finally overwhelmed him, Dr. Webb explained with professional gravity. I administered a mild sedative last evening. He was quite agitated about the parish accounts. Perhaps the guilt became unbearable during the night. The search party found the Reverend's hat positioned carefully on the Mill Weir's stone parapet, his prayer book placed nearby with its ribbon marker precisely between the psalms. Miss Ashworth noted how a single strand of spider's web connected the hat to the bridge stonework, unbroken, suggesting careful placement rather than desperate abandonment. More significantly, the familiar diamond-patterned footprints pressed deep into the mill path's pale marl told their own story. These were not the Reverend's sensible Oxfords, but the expensive London shoes she had observed in the vestry. Someone else had visited this supposedly isolated location, someone whose presence the staged evidence was designed to conceal. Mrs. Finch's testimony provided crucial details she had initially withheld from misguided loyalty. Dr. Webb brought the sleeping draught around 9 o'clock, she explained through tears. Said the Reverend needed proper rest after all the strain. They talked privately in the study while I prepared the morning linens. When I looked in later, the Reverend seemed drowsy but was writing at his desk. Miss Ashworth examined the study with methodical precision. 2 teacups sat drying in the scullery, one bearing the medicinal scent of valerian and chloral, the other retaining traces of orange oil and something sharper that made her tongue tingle. The typewriter's carriage remained pulled to its full extension, a habit she recognized from entirely different hands than the Reverend's careful hunt and peck method. The prayer book's placement particularly intrigued her. Its marker rested between the Psalms, yet the Reverend had been preparing Sunday's sermon from Romans, a discrepancy that suggested unfamiliar hands arranging what they believed would appear natural. As the day progressed, the village embraced this new tragedy with the same eager relief they had shown for Thomas Hartwell's arrest. Suicide provided moral resolution, the guilty party punishing himself, sparing the community the discomfort of formal justice. Mrs. Hartwell spoke sanctimoniously of divine retribution, while Mr. Craik observed that money troubles always end badly. Yet Miss Ashworth recognized the staged suicide's true purpose. With Mrs. Finch's revelation about Thomas's actual concerns regarding parish finances, and her own investigation uncovering the systematic embezzlement, the real perpetrators faced exposure. The Reverend's elimination served multiple purposes, removing a weak link in their conspiracy, providing a convenient scapegoat for the missing funds, and deflecting attention from the true architect of these crimes. Dr. Webb's behavior throughout the crisis struck her as remarkably controlled for someone witnessing a patient's tragic end. His immediate presence at the scene, his ready explanations for every anomaly, his subtle direction of the search efforts, all suggested foreknowledge rather than shocked response. The bicycle tracks on the towpath told their own story, curving away from the bridge before vanishing into harder ground. Someone had wheeled a bicycle to this location, then carried it back to avoid leaving obvious evidence. The Reverend's own bicycle remained untouched in the vicarage shed, its chain bearing the light rust of recent disuse. As evening settled over Bramblewick, Miss Ashworth reflected on the killer's escalating desperation. The staged suicide revealed both sophisticated planning and growing panic. Dr. Webb's medical expertise provided perfect cover for administering sedatives, while his professional standing deflected suspicion from his nocturnal activities. The conspiracy was unravelling faster than its architects could control. Thomas Hartwell's arrest had provided temporary cover, but Mrs. Finch's revelations and Miss Ashworth's persistent investigation had forced more drastic measures. The Reverend's elimination demonstrated that no one was safe from those willing to murder for financial gain and social position. Yet, in their desperation, the perpetrators had revealed crucial evidence. The typewritten confession, the staged physical evidence, the convenient timing, all pointed toward calculated murder, disguised as moral collapse. Miss Ashworth understood that the killer's next move would likely target her own investigation, making speed essential in exposing the truth before Bramblewick's conspiracy of silence claimed another victim. The second vanishing had shifted the game's stakes dramatically, revealing the true depths of evil concealed beneath the village's respectable surface. Monday afternoon brought the kind of gentle sunshine that made Bramblewick's recent tragedies seem almost impossible. Yet Miss Ashworth understood that such perfect weather often accompanied the darkest human revelations. Her careful preparations for what appeared to be a simple tea gathering served purposes far more complex than social courtesy, each detail arranged with the precision of a chess master positioning pieces for checkmate. The invitation list had been crafted with surgical deliberation. Mrs. Finch arrived first, her usual composure still fractured by the weekend's revelations, hands trembling as she accepted her customary corner chair. Dr. Webb followed with professional punctuality, his charming smile masking what Miss Ashworth recognised as carefully controlled tension. Mrs. Pemberton bustled in with her inevitable contribution of lemon-curd tartlets, while Mr. Liddon shuffled apologetically through the door, his weathered face showing the strain of recent events. Miss Ashworth had also contrived, with gentle vagueness, to have Inspector Brant drop by if he were passing, a phrase the inspector interpreted with admirable precision, positioning himself where he could observe without appearing to participate in formal investigation. The sitting room wore its most domestic face, low afternoon sun filtering through net curtains, while the aroma of Earl Grey mingled with the scent of fresh scones. Miss Ashworth began with the safest topics: weather, village gossip, the shortage of decent sugar, allowing conversation to meander toward more dangerous ground as naturally as a country path, curves around ancient obstacles. It was such a muddle at the fete, she observed mildly, replenishing cups with practised grace, all those little details out of place. I do dislike when doors are left unlatched. It gives one the feeling that anyone might wander anywhere. Mrs. Pemberton, who preferred doors firmly shut on principle, nodded vigorously while balancing a tartlet. Quite right. Why, I never go into the church during such commotions, except when I popped in with spare napkins. Someone had spilled curd all over a programme near the vestry. I cleaned it immediately, but honestly, people ought to use plates. Ah, said Miss Ashworth with quiet satisfaction. That would explain the sticky traces. Dr. Webb's eyes flicked toward the tartlets with barely perceptible distaste, before his professional composure reasserted itself. Miss Ashworth noted how his expensive shoes, polished to quiet perfection, revealed that distinctive diamond-patterned sole when he shifted position. The poor Reverend's tragedy has weighed upon all our minds, she continued, producing a plate of orange sponge cake, fragrant, light, and piped with just enough citrus zest to be memorable, though I confess certain details continue puzzling me. She watched carefully as each guest served themselves according to habit. Mrs. Finch chose the smallest portion, always apologetic. Mrs. Pemberton selected the largest slice with missionary enthusiasm. Mr. Liddon waited until others were served. Dr. Webb declined with a physician's practised smile. "No, thank you. I find orange too bitter in cakes," he said. Then, after the smallest pause, added with professional smoothness, "It masks other flavours too efficiently." "Does it indeed?" Miss Ashworth replied, innocent as morning dew. "I've always thought a true bitter declares itself honestly enough." The conversation drifted to bicycles, with Miss Ashworth reminiscing about her father's rally and how treacherous certain terrains could prove. "One cannot wheel a bicycle through Marle without leaving testimony," she observed to no one in particular, "unless one carries it, which is such an unnatural posture it must show somewhere." "In the shoulders, mister," Liddon agreed unexpectedly, "and trouser hems." "Or shoe leather, Doctor," Webb contributed smoothly. "Marle clings distinctively. One can always determine where a man has walked by what adheres to his footwear." "Can one?" Miss Ashworth's smile remained purely domestic. "I suppose one might also determine where a man has not walked by what fails to cling." The moment had arrived for more direct pressure. Miss Ashworth produced a slim folder tied with ribbon, setting it beside the teapot with casual precision. "I've prepared a small memorandum for the diocesan treasurer, merely housekeeping tidiness, subscription lists, receipt booklet serial numbers, and notes about carbon copies found in the vicarage desk. I do dislike misfiled carbons. One never knows what impressions have been preserved." The room's temperature seemed to drop imperceptibly. Dr. Webb's gaze flicked to the folder with the speed of fingers snatching from flame, while Mrs. Finch swallowed nervously. "How thorough," Dr. Webb said lightly, though I doubt the treasurer examined serial numbers closely. "Oh, but he does," Miss Ashworth replied. "He believes firmly in proper sequence." Broken patterns distress him considerably. She eased the ribbon aside as if to display contents, then seemed to reconsider. "Perhaps another time. I shouldn't spoil a pleasant tea with arithmetic." Inspector Brant, content to appear slow while remaining thorough, interjected casually, "Doctor, about sedatives, do you often recommend them with citrus flavouring?" "For palatability?" Dr. Webb took slightly too long to respond. "Only when patients resist medication. Bitterness requires disguising. Common pharmacological practice." "Common indeed," Miss Ashworth murmured, "though I cannot imagine the Reverend accepting sedatives willingly." He disliked anything clouding his scholarly precision. That observation struck exactly where intended. Dr. Webb's eyebrows lifted, reflex quickening thought into speech. He couldn't have written clearly in that condition. Not with a fresh typewriter ribbon dragging the characters so. The sentence broke on its own revelation. He smiled with the care of someone extracting splinters. "I meant sedatives impair fine motor coordination. Typing, for instance." "How considerate of you to notice his typing difficulties," Miss Ashworth said, pouring tea he hadn't requested. "Your attention to detail proves most illuminating." Mrs. Finch, who had been studying faces with growing comprehension, suddenly burst out, "Miss Ashworth, I must confess, when I collected the tea service that evening, there were 2 cups from the study, not 1. I smelled orange oil on the Reverend's cup, which seemed odd since he detested marmalade." "Many households use orange, Doctor," Webb said quietly. "Not the vicarage," Mrs. Finch replied with unexpected firmness. "He couldn't abide citrus in any form." That small certainty settled over the gathering like dust made visible in afternoon light. The conspiracy was unravelling under gentle pressure, each participant's reactions revealing shared knowledge and mutual complicity. Miss Ashworth folded her hands with final precision. "I've often observed that smallest details undo the strongest deceptions. Early book returns that should have been treasured, typewritten notes when fountain pens lay within reach, shoes familiar with mill paths, keys that wander mysteriously, orange flavouring where none should exist, and Latin commas that cannot bring themselves to appear." The trap had closed with inexorable logic, revealing the truth that Bramblewick had desperately tried to conceal beneath its respectable surface, the evening light filtering through St. Bartholomew's stained glass. Windows cast long shadows across the nave as Miss Ashworth positioned herself near the altar, her gentle voice carrying clearly through the ancient stone arches. Inspector Brant stood quietly beside her, while Dr. Webb, Mrs. Finch, and Mr. Liddon formed a small semicircle, each bearing the weight of recent revelations in their own manner. The financial web unravelled. "We gather here," Miss Ashworth began with characteristic understatement, "where this tragedy truly began, not with romantic disappointment, but with the desperate love of a husband for his dying wife." Her eyes rested briefly on Mrs. Finch, whose tears had already begun. The Reverend's financial difficulties commenced during Mrs. Fairweather's illness, when medical expenses far exceeded his modest income. Experimental treatments, London consultations, private care, all beyond his means, yet essential for the woman he cherished. Dr. Webb remained composed, though his hands betrayed the slightest tremor as Miss Ashworth continued her methodical reconstruction. The embezzlement began gradually, small amounts from charitable collections, justified as temporary borrowing, but desperation breeds corruption, and the amounts increased. The building fund, the children's hospital donations, the roof repair money, all diverted to pay mounting medical bills. And who better to facilitate this arrangement than the physician who understood both the necessity and the opportunity? The Church's silence amplified every word as Miss Ashworth traced the conspiracy's development. Dr. Webb, your involvement extended beyond medical care to financial complicity. You knew the source of your payments, encouraged the arrangement, perhaps even suggested which parish funds might be temporarily redirected. A perfect partnership, the desperate cleric and the accommodating physician. The discovery and confrontation. Rosalind's methodical nature made discovery inevitable, Miss Ashworth observed, her tone remaining conversational despite the gravity of her revelations. The Hampshire Charities Register, returned early to the library, provided the comparative data she needed. Her Thursday consultation with you, Doctor. Webb was not romantic but professional, seeking guidance for an impossible ethical dilemma. Mrs. Finch sobbed quietly as the full extent of the deception became clear. Miss Ashworth gestured toward the vestry door, standing slightly ajar in the gathering dusk. Saturday's fete provided the perfect opportunity for a final confrontation. The bell-ringing demonstration masked voices, while the crowd's attention remained diverted. You arranged to meet Rosalind here, using Mr. Liddon's borrowed key to access the vestry privately. Mr. Liddon started at this revelation, his weathered face showing dawning comprehension of how his trust had been exploited. The moment of violence, the torn programme stained with Mrs. Pemberton's lemon curd, proved Rosalind's presence in the vestry, Miss Ashworth continued, her voice growing quieter as she approached the tragedy's heart. But your diamond-patterned footprints in the marl told the true story, Doctor. Webb expensive London shoes, unsuited to parish flagstones, leaving distinctive impressions that connected you to both the vestry and the mill path. Dr. Webb's professional mask began to crack as Miss Ashworth reconstructed the fatal encounter. Rosalind threatened immediate exposure, not from spite, but from moral certainty that theft was theft regardless of motivation. Your medical reputation, your practice, your carefully constructed life, all would crumble. In that moment of panic, you made a fatal choice. The confession came gradually, each admission dragged from Dr. Webb's crumbling defences. The sedative had been intended merely to incapacitate, buying time for negotiation. But Rosalind's inflexible determination and threats of immediate action had forced more desperate measures. The bell tower, Miss Ashworth said softly, provided the privacy you required. The ringing chamber, with its treacherous stairs and hanging ropes, became the scene of struggle. Whether by accident or design, Rosalind fell, striking her head against the bell frame. The cover-up and second murder. The staged evidence followed, the conveniently placed handkerchief, the misdirection toward romantic motives, Thomas Hartwell as the perfect scapegoat. But when Mrs. Finch revealed the true nature of Thomas's concerns, and my investigation threatened to expose the financial conspiracy, a second elimination became necessary. Miss Ashworth's voice hardened slightly as she described the Reverend's murder. The typewritten confession on unfamiliar machinery, the orange-flavoured sedative to mask bitterness, the prayer book marked at the wrong passage, all revealed a hand unfamiliar with the victim's habits. The staged suicide at the mill weir, complete with theatrical props and unbroken spider webs, demonstrated calculation rather than desperation. Dr. Webb's final resistance collapsed as Inspector Brant stepped forward. The physician's carefully maintained composure dissolved into admission, not of guilt, but of necessity. He had killed to protect his reputation, his practice, his position in society. 2 innocent lives destroyed to maintain the facade of respectability. Justice in the ancient stones. As Inspector Brant placed Dr. Webb under formal arrest, Miss Ashworth reflected on the tragic cascade of events that had begun with love and ended with calculated murder. The church bells remained silent, their bronze voices stilled until Bramblewick could hear them again without remembering their role in concealing violence. The truth had finally emerged in the place where it had been buried, revealing that beneath the village's placid surface lay currents of greed, desperation, and moral corruption that could destroy even the most carefully maintained facades. Human nature, in all its complexity, had once again proven that the greatest mysteries lay not in external circumstances, but in the dangerous depths of ordinary hearts pushed beyond their moral boundaries. The morning after Dr. Webb's arrest dawned grey and subdued over Bramblewick, as if the village itself needed time to absorb the revelations that had shattered its carefully maintained facade. Miss Ashworth observed from her cottage window as Inspector Brandt's men methodically searched the locations the physician had finally disclosed: the bell tower's hidden medieval chamber, where Rosalind's body lay concealed behind ancient tapestries, and the disused mill cottage where the Reverend had been hidden after his murder. Thomas Hartwell's release occurred with bureaucratic efficiency but emotional complexity. His return to the village 3 days later revealed a young man aged beyond his years, his faith in community justice permanently altered. The residents who had so eagerly embraced his guilt now struggled with embarrassment and awkward apologies. Mrs. Hartwell, her social pretensions entirely collapsed, found herself unexpectedly humbled, focusing her energies on protecting her son rather than maintaining appearances. The practical aftermath required delicate handling. The missing charitable funds were quietly restored through anonymous contributions, Thomas's legal expertise proving invaluable in structuring arrangements that protected contributors while ensuring institutional integrity. The diocese appointed a temporary administrator for parish affairs, removing future temptation while preserving the church's reputation. Mrs. Finch remained at the vicarage, maintaining the property with the same meticulous care she had always shown, though her former discretion had been replaced by painful understanding that silence could enable evil as effectively as active participation. Her testimony during the subsequent trial would prove crucial in securing Dr. Webb's conviction. The funerals, held within a week of each other, marked the community's formal farewell to its innocence. Rosalind's service drew mourners from across the county, testament to the young woman's impact during her brief return to village life. The Reverend's burial proceeded more quietly, attended by those who understood that desperation had corrupted a fundamentally decent man. Both ceremonies were conducted by a visiting bishop, the local pulpit remaining appropriately empty. Dr. Webb's trial proceeded through the autumn assizes with clinical precision. His defense attempted to portray the deaths as tragic accidents resulting from financial desperation, but the prosecution's methodical presentation of evidence, much of it gathered through Miss Ashworth's patient observation, demonstrated clear premeditation. The jury required less than 2 hours to reach their verdict. As winter approached, Bramblewick developed new rhythms around its altered circumstances. The annual harvest festival proceeded with subdued celebration, participants acutely aware of absent voices. The church bells, once silenced by association with tragedy, gradually resumed their customary marking of time and seasons. Yet certain changes proved permanent. Conversations carried different undercurrents, relationships bore new cautions, and trust required more deliberate construction. The village had learned that surfaces could deceive, that respectability might conceal corruption, and that ordinary people could commit extraordinary evil under sufficient pressure. Miss Ashworth's role in exposing the truth earned her both gratitude and wariness. Some residents appreciated her persistence in revealing facts that formal investigation had missed. Others found her analytical approach unsettling, preferring mysteries to remain mysterious rather than subjected to uncomfortable scrutiny. The new vicar, when finally appointed, proved to be a younger man with modern ideas about financial transparency and community engagement. His arrival signalled Bramblewick's determination to move forward while learning from recent tragedy. The parish accounts were maintained with scrupulous accuracy, multiple oversight mechanisms preventing any repetition of past abuses. Thomas Hartwell's practice flourished as clients appreciated his experience with complex investigations and his commitment to absolute honesty. His near execution for crimes he had not committed left him with profound understanding of justice's fragility and the importance of methodical fact-gathering over convenient assumptions. As spring returned to Bramblewick, Miss Ashworth reflected on the lessons embedded in the village's recent trauma. The community had survived its encounter with evil, though not unchanged. She had observed how ordinary people, faced with extraordinary circumstances, could choose paths leading either toward heroism or tragedy. Dr. Webb's medical knowledge and social position had provided opportunities for both healing and harm, his choice of the latter serving as permanent reminder that privilege carried corresponding responsibilities. The mystery of the vicar's daughter had been solved through patient observation, methodical analysis, and willingness to question comfortable assumptions. Yet Miss Ashworth understood that the deeper mystery, why good people sometimes chose evil paths, would continue challenging human understanding for as long as communities existed to harbour both saints and sinners beneath their placid surfaces. Walking through the village on a particularly fine morning, she noted the subtle signs of healing: children's laughter returning to the green, neighbours resuming their customary exchanges, the church bells marking another peaceful hour. Bramblewick bore invisible scars that would influence behaviour for years to come, but life, with its remarkable resilience, had reasserted itself in quiet, determined ways. The vicar's daughter would be remembered not as a victim, but as someone who had chosen truth over comfort, justice over convenience, a legacy that would outlast the tragedy that claimed her life. The autumn light, filtering through Miss Ashworth's sitting-room windows, carried that particular golden quality that made even the most ordinary objects seem touched with significance. 6 months had passed since the resolution of what the county newspapers had termed the Bramblewick murders, though Miss Ashworth found such sensational language inadequate to capture the subtle complexities of human motivation she had observed throughout the investigation. She sat in her customary chair, her knitting abandoned in favour of a leather-bound journal where she recorded observations about human nature, not for publication, but for her own understanding of the patterns that seemed to repeat themselves with disturbing regularity across different communities and circumstances. The case of Rosalind Fairweather had provided particularly rich material for such reflection. The village had settled into new rhythms by now, though careful observers could still detect the subtle alterations in social dynamics that marked Bramblewick's passage through tragedy. Mrs. Pemberton continued her charitable work with renewed vigilance, having learned that oversight committees met in bright daylight for good reason. Mr. Liddon maintained the church grounds with methodical care, his spare keys now kept in a locked tin box with proper documentation. Thomas Hartwell's practice had flourished, his experience with false accusation having given him particular insight into defending those whom circumstances had made appear guilty. His commitment to transparent financial procedures had become legendary. Every parish and society he advised now adopted simple practices: 2 signatures on disbursements, quarterly public summaries, and plain language explanations for all collections. The community no longer called such measures cynical. They called them sound. Mrs. Finch remained at the vicarage, her former discretion transformed into clear-eyed candour that served the parish well. When she spoke of the Reverend, she did so with honesty that allowed compassion to coexist with truth. He had loved greatly, erred grievously, and paid a price no one would have wished. Her loyalty, once expressed through silence, now manifested as protective vigilance against future deceptions. Miss Ashworth reflected on the various motivations that had driven the tragedy's participants toward their fateful choices. The Reverend's embezzlement had begun with love, desperate, overwhelming love for his dying wife that had corrupted his moral judgment. His weakness had been human and understandable, even if ultimately inexcusable. Dr. Webb's involvement revealed more disturbing psychology. His initial complicity had been opportunistic, recognizing profit in the Reverend's desperation while maintaining plausible deniability. But when exposure threatened his carefully constructed reputation, he had chosen murder over confession, demonstrating how professional pride could override fundamental moral constraints. The physician's tragedy lay in his intelligence and education, which should have provided ethical guidance but instead enabled sophisticated deception. Rosalind herself had embodied the moral clarity that often proves dangerous in communities where compromise maintains surface harmony. Her refusal to accept that theft was justified by noble motives had made her elimination seem necessary to those whose survival depended on continued deception. Yet her meticulous investigation had ultimately brought truth to light, even at the cost of her life. The investigation had revealed how easily ordinary people could support false narratives that served others' purposes. The community's eager acceptance of Thomas Hartwell's guilt, not from malice, but because his conviction provided resolution without requiring uncomfortable self-examination, demonstrated the dangerous satisfaction with which villages could embrace convenient solutions over uncomfortable truths. Yet the case had also demonstrated human nature's capacity for growth. Mrs. Finch's eventual courage in revealing uncomfortable facts, Thomas's determination to rebuild without bitterness, the community's gradual acknowledgement of their complicity in rushing to judgment, all suggested that even the darkest experiences could generate wisdom and compassion. As evening shadows lengthened across the village green, Miss Ashworth considered the broader implications of what she had witnessed. Bramblewick's tragedy illustrated how quickly civilized communities could descend into violence when fundamental assumptions were challenged, yet also how resilient human bonds could prove when tested by adversity. The mystery had been solved through methodical observation and logical deduction, but the deeper mystery of human motivation remained as complex as ever. People continued to surprise her with both their capacity for evil and their potential for redemption, their willingness to destroy others for personal advantage balanced against their ability to sacrifice for principles larger than themselves. She closed her journal as the church bells chimed 7 o'clock, their bronze voices carrying across the peaceful village with no trace of the secrets they had once concealed. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new mysteries, new opportunities to observe the endless complexity of human nature in all its contradictory glory. The vicar's daughter who had disappeared would be remembered as someone who chose truth over comfort, justice over convenience, a legacy that would continue inspiring others long after the circumstances of her death had faded into local history. And Miss Ashworth, keeper of Bramblewick's conscience, would continue watching, learning, and occasionally intervening when ordinary people required extraordinary wisdom to navigate the moral complexities that defined their shared humanity.